Chapter 7. Holly read her letter one more time. She already had its contents memorized. Holly had been quite thrilled when the tiny owl had arrived at breakfast with its message. She hadn't really expected her parents to write back. The letter was brief. "Dear Holly," it began, "hope you are doing well. We love you and miss you, Mom and Dad." After the excitement of its arrival wore off, the letter reminded Holly how much she missed her parents. Sure, the people were nice here, but it wasn't home. Thinking of her parents made Holly realize how much she longed for something normal. She wanted to use a pencil instead of a quill. She longed for steps that didn't move, pictures that didn't talk, books that didn't fight back, and a place where the ghosts didn't pop up unexpectedly. Everyone else seemed happy at Hogwarts, and that only seemed to intensify her feelings of homesickness. Holly would have happily returned home in a minute, except she knew she needed Hogwarts to learn how to deal with her empathic abilities. The first-year students all seemed eager to attend class today. Everyone, that is, except Holly. Today's class was titled Defense Against the Dark Arts. That sounded scary. Mixing potions, moving cubes, and digging roots all seemed harmless enough, but the dark arts? Holly had already looked through her book, The Dark Forces, A Guide to Self-Protection Revised, in an effort to complete last week's homework. It contained all sorts of scary-sounding topics: werewolves, trolls, vampires, boggarts, hexes, and jinxes, counter-curses. Holly wanted nothing to do with any of that. Something else was preying on Holly's mind. James was right. No doubt her relationship to Harry Potter would come out, and when it did, would all the Hufflepuffs whisper and point behind her back? She dreaded the day and didn't know what to do about it. "Hey, Holly, hurry up," shouted Mark. "You want to get there early, remember?" Holly sighed and tucked away the letter in a pocket. She was stuck here now whether she liked it or not, and that meant attending the Defense Against the Dark Arts class. Best to get it over with. Right across from the door to the Defense Against the Dark Arts room hung a huge painting. Holly lingered outside of class to look at it. She recognized the background as the Great Hall of Hogwarts, though in a much battered condition. A single ray of sunlight streamed in, illuminating the figures in the front. The main figure was that of Harry Potter, a much younger, thinner Harry Potter, to be sure, but definitely Harry Potter. He stood in wizard robes, wand extended, facing a second figure, tall and thin, also in wizard robes, only his back was visible, but Holly knew this must be Lord Voldemort. Lord Voldemort, too, had his wand extended. A jet of green light shot from Lord Voldemort's wand, and a brilliant yellow light came from Harry Potter's wand. The lights looked ready to meet at any moment. What was that? Holly had been so busy looking that she missed whatever Mark had just said. "I said the picture doesn't move," Mark repeated. "I've stood in front of it several times waiting and watching, but it never moves. Isn't that strange?" "I think it looks fine just the way it is," stated Becky firmly. "Come on, Holly, before the other students arrive." Reluctantly, Holly left the painting, determined to examine it more at a later time. Professor Lovegood was reading a book when they arrived. She wore large, oversized lavender rhinestone glasses that made her eyes look even bigger, and had long, straggly blonde hair. 3 large plume-like feathers, one red, one green, and one turquoise blue, poked out of her hair. A purple butterfly clip held some of her hair back in place. The clip fluttered its wings gently. Professor Lovegood never looked at the trio when they arrived, but just continued reading. The 3 sat down and got out their notes and supplies. "You've a new wand, Miss Smith," commented Professor Lovegood serenely, not even glancing up from her book. Becky smiled, pleased that the professor had noticed. "Yes," she replied, "it's ashen unicorn hair. I got it from Ollivander's. Isn't it beautiful?" "Mr. Ollivander makes excellent wands," said Professor Lovegood instead, and continued to read, turning a page. Holly realized with astonishment that the book the professor was reading was upside down. Presently the professor asked, "What happened to your other wand?" "It wasn't right somehow," began Becky, not sure how to explain. Yes, agreed Professor Lovegood, not waiting for further explanation. Some wands just aren't right somehow. She turned another page and then spoke again, still not looking up from her book. You must be Miss Wycliffe. Yes, ma'am, replied Holly. You don't look sick at all. I'm not, agreed Holly. Not now, that is, she amended. Oh, came that same unconcerned voice as she turned another page. That's good. You can't learn when you're sick and miss classes. Professor Lovegood looked up from her book and regarded Holly intently. She noted Sasha, curled quietly on Holly's lap, and then spoke in that same unconcerned voice. The last time I saw a student who was constantly with a cat, she turned out to be an empath. Holly froze. Professor Lovegood returned her attention to her book and then continued serenely. She was a Gryffindor. She had some sort of problem sorting out emotions. Holly looked up at the professor, not knowing what to say. But the professor turned another page, clearly not expecting a response from Holly. The room remained silent while Professor Lovegood read another 2 pages before speaking again. But she got over it. I'm sure you will too. More students started trooping in. Slytherin students. Professor Lovegood put down her book, took off her glasses, and stood ready to start the class. Once Professor Lovegood collected all the homework of the previous day, she proceeded to lecture on identifying the difference between magical creatures, enchantments, and things actually touched by dark magic. Rackle-squirts, fizz-gibbons, and doodleworts act that way naturally. They are not inherently dark, she continued. It's just a matter of knowing how to deal with them. But when spoons, cups, and bedspreads start to behave in a way they shouldn't, like talking, lighting fires, and making dinner, that's the time to get worried. Cursed items are the most difficult to identify. They are often something that looks common or ordinary, placed somewhere easily accessible. The cursed item doesn't quite belong somehow, and that difference tends to tempt the unwary to touch or pick it up, thus becoming affected by the curse. The safest thing to do when you encounter something suspicious is keep away from it, and find someone more knowledgeable to investigate and take care of the matter, she concluded. One of the Slytherin boys raised his hand. He was thin and blond with arrogant features. Excuse me, Professor, he said, but what is a fizz-gibbon? I've never heard of such a thing. There was a smirk on his face as he spoke, and Holly could feel waves of disbelief emanating from both Slytherins and Hufflepuffs at the same time. Fizz-gibbons are very shy creatures, about the size of an ant, Mr. Malfoy, responded Professor Lovegood calmly. Her purple butterfly clip fluttered about and latched onto a different lock of hair, causing the turquoise feather to tip precariously. They like to come out at night and bite people very hard when they least expect it. I don't think there's such a thing as a rackle-squirt either, voiced a Slytherin girl boldly. She had beady black eyes, thick short brown braids, and a chunky, muscular body. Just because you have never seen a rackle-squirt, Miss Goyle, responded Professor Lovegood, unperturbed, doesn't mean they don't exist. It only shows how elusive they are, and how strong their desire is to not be seen. But when they thump incessantly on your head at night, no headache potion will stop the pain. Professor Lovegood resecured her turquoise feather and continued with the lecture as if there had been no interruptions. When she finished, she gave out new homework assignments and announced it would be time for wand practice. The first spell we will be practicing is a defensive spell called Expelliarmus. Expelliarmus, she continued by way of introduction, is a disarming spell. It is a popular spell for use during wizard duels. It is also quite useful should you wish to knock the twigs out of bow-truckle hands. And, if done properly, it can knock a thieving gnome across the yard. What you do is, Richards leaned over to Malfoy. Bow-truckles, he snorted, loud enough to be heard by the whole class. As if I care. The blond boy smirked in agreement. It was a rather infuriating-looking smirk. Professor Lovegood gave no sign of hearing the comment, but without missing a beat continued talking. It might interest the class to know that mastery of the spell is required of all first-year students before they may pass this class. That got everyone's attention. Are you serious? Broke in Malfoy derisively. The Ministry thinks that tossing gnomes around is so important that it becomes a requirement? A chorus of "Yeah!" were shouted out from the other Slytherin students. The noise forced Professor Lovegood to stop her talking and look directly at the offending students. "While I would like to think the ministry saw the importance of disarming Bowtreckles, Mr. Malfoy," she began, "I suspect the ministry requires mastery of the spell because it was the one Harry Potter used to defeat Lord Voldemort." The whole class drew in a swift intake of breath at that. Becky leaned over to Mark and whispered, "Who's Lord Voldemort?" "Hush!" replied Mark urgently, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Miss Goyle spoke up. "You dare to speak the Dark Lord's name?" "Of course," replied Professor Lovegood serenely. "This is a defense against the dark arts class. Where better?" There was complete silence throughout the class as the students considered this. Then Richard spoke up with a derisive laugh in his voice. "Are you telling me that the greatest wizard of our time was defeated with a mere disarming spell?" "Yes," said Professor Lovegood simply. "I was there. I heard the spell shouted. Perhaps Lord Voldemort would have been better off had he chosen a defensive spell of his own, instead of an unforgivable curse." That brought about another swift intake of breath from the whole class. She had everyone's attention. "Of course," she continued, seemingly unaware of the change in the atmosphere of the class, "I can understand why he did it. He wanted to end things quickly. After all, Lord Voldemort had just shouted out to everyone that he had killed Harry Potter, brought out Harry's body as proof, and then there was Harry Potter again, looking quite healthy and alive, ready to face him. It must have been most embarrassing." The professor drew her own wand, seemingly oblivious that the Slytherin students had grown quite angry at her disparaging comments. "And as for calling him the greatest wizard of our times, Mr. Richards," Professor Lovegood continued blithely, "I hardly think so. After all, Lord Voldemort lost." Ignoring the stir her comments caused, Professor Lovegood pointed her own wand at a huge mirror on one side of the room. The mirror swung open, revealing a room beyond. It was lined with standing suits of armor. Each suit was posed with one armored glove extended. In each raised glove was a single feather. "We shall begin," continued Professor Lovegood, "with trying to remove the feather out of the hand. Everyone, find your own feather." Professor Lovegood ignored the loud mutterings of the Slytherin students, who were clearly upset at her dismissal of the abilities of Lord Voldemort. She calmly moved around the room, correcting student positions and pronunciations. Soon the room was filled with loud blasts as students tried out the spell. Lots of things went flying. Unfortunately, none of them were feathers. Becky was sure she had made her feather move, but Holly suspected that it moved more due to the wind caused by flying helmets and other armor parts than anything Becky had said. Holly had a difficult time practicing the spell. The first helmet that went flying landed with a loud clatter next to Holly's feet. Sasha, much to Richard's delight, leaped off of Holly's shoulder and skittered into the classroom, taking refuge under Holly's desk. Holly tried to concentrate and cast her spells without Sasha's insulating purrs. Unfortunately, the room was filled with disgruntled Slytherins. They clearly had not liked and were still upset over Professor Lovegood's comments concerning Lord Voldemort, and frustrated students who couldn't make the spell work, and that was everyone. Their feelings naturally spilled over into Holly's efforts. She couldn't even get her wand to react to the command. Holly was in tears by the end of the practice. She even secretly wondered if Richards had deliberately sent that first helmet flying her way. But everyone was so bad at the spell, she doubted it. Professor Lovegood seemed unconcerned at the lack of student success. "Don't worry," she said calmly. "That's why we start working on this spell so soon. You may come into this room to practice at any time, when it's not in use. We have all year to get the spell right." Holly made a note to herself to return to the room to practice when the Slytherins weren't around. Compared to the defense against the dark arts class, Transfigurations was a breeze. The head of the Hufflepuff house, Professor Iverson, was the instructor. Though stern, she didn't seem unreasonable. When she stood to lecture, though, Holly gave a small gasp. Professor Iverson was tall, very tall. With those long legs and long arms and dressed in a brown and orange flecked robe, Holly was reminded of a walking stick insect she had once seen on the tube. The Gryffindors attended this class with the Hufflepuffs. As they were generally a cheerful group, the whole mood of the class seemed fairly light. Students laughed openly at their own and each other's mistakes instead of getting frustrated and angry. Holly's matchstick actually got a bit silvery and pointy by the end of the period. Certainly other students like Rose and Mark got their matches to look more like needles, but Holly didn't feel totally lost or out of place during instruction. After lunch, Mark announced that he was taking a nap and suggested both Holly and Becky get a bit of rest too. "Whatever for?" asked Holly. "We've got astronomy tonight, remember?" he announced. "Midnight, on the lawn. Last week," he confided, "I could barely keep my eyes open during potions the next day. Professor Slughorn took 2 house points from Hufflepuff and assigned me extra homework when he caught me yawning. He seemed to think I thought his class was boring. Well, it was, but that wasn't why I was yawning." So Holly and Becky decided to get a bit of rest too. Holly couldn't sleep. She managed to rest a bit, but that fiasco in the Defense Against the Dark Arts class distressed her greatly. She decided to use what was left of her afternoon to return to the classroom and see if she could do better without all the distractions. Putting Sasha on her shoulder, she wound her way through the halls and corridors back to the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom. That painting still hung across from the front door. Holly lingered over it a bit. Its lack of movement drew her like a magnet. She wanted to look at it longer, but maybe later. Holly resolutely entered the class. The room was empty. She walked over to the mirror and realized suddenly she had no idea how to open the door to the practice room. She drew her wand and waved it in all sorts of ways, shouting, "Open! Enter!" and other such words, but all to no avail. In frustration, she turned to leave. "There is more than one way to get a door to open," said a serene voice behind her. Holly recognized the voice as that of Professor Lovegood. She looked around but saw no one. Holly looked some more. The professor had to be there. Finally, Holly thought of looking up. There was Professor Lovegood. She was perched from a weird skeleton that was hanging from the ceiling. Susan claimed it was the skeleton of a dragon. Professor Lovegood was reading a magazine. This time Holly could read the title because it was upright. It said Racklefurts, Fact or Fiction. Of course, Professor Lovegood was upside down. She had draped her body over the back leg bones of the dragon, and her long blonde hair dangled loosely. Her butterfly had clipped 2 of the feathers together. "Try knocking," the professor suggested, not even looking up, or was it down, from her magazine. Holly returned to the mirror and gave it 3 solid raps. Nothing happened. She pulled and tugged at the mirror, and it still wouldn't open. "You're not a 3rd year," came Professor Lovegood's voice. Holly puzzled over the professor's words a while. Then she smiled. Again Holly advanced to the mirror. This time she gave it a solid, single rap. The mirror swung open easily, revealing the room beyond. "Thank you," said Holly, and walked inside. The mirror door swung shut after her. Sasha jumped down and immediately started to swat a fallen feather. Alone in the room, Holly selected a suit of armor and a feather. She aimed her wand carefully and shouted, "Expelliarmus!" Nothing happened. Holly shifted the angle of the wand and tried again. Still nothing. She tried different swishing movements, different accents on the word Expelliarmus, all to no avail. Nothing seemed to work. Finally, Holly quit in despair. It hadn't been the distractions after all. It was herself. She was no good at this stuff. "Expelliarmus is a defensive spell," came a quiet voice behind her. Professor Lovegood had entered the room and stood behind her. Holly hadn't heard the door open. "Your wand is not the enemy. Your wand is an extension of your arm. It is part of you," she continued. "Close your eyes." Holly closed them. "Remember the joy you felt when you first swished this wand at Ollivanders?" Holly nodded. "Think of that moment. Open your eyes and look at your target." Holly opened her eyes. "Point your arm." Holly extended her arm. Now the wand." Holly did so. "Move your wand like this when you say your spell." And Professor Lovegood gently moved Holly's wrist into the correct motions. "Now say the spell." "Expelliarmus!" shouted Holly as she swished her wand. A warm tingle seemed to flow through her arm and out the wand. On the other side, a white feather drifted lazily through the air. "I did it!" Holly said excitedly. "So you have," agreed Professor Lovegood with a dreamy smile. Holly aimed her wand at another feather. "Expelliarmus!" she shouted again. This feather, too, floated up and over the helmet. Sasha jumped up to catch it. Over and over Holly aimed her wand, and felt the satisfaction of watching the feather float out of the gloved grasp. When she finally tired, she looked around the room and realized she was alone again. Satisfied with her efforts, Holly opened the door and left the practice room. Sasha followed behind. The defense against the dark arts classroom seemed empty also. Holly even checked the skeleton as she passed. The painting just outside and opposite the door loomed large in front of her. This time, Holly stopped to study it further. Beneath the painting she read an inscription. It said, "Sometimes you've got to think about more than your own safety. Sometimes you've got to think about the greater good. Harry Potter." The details of the painting were incredible. The grim determination on Harry Potter's face as he cast his spell. The slender, pale white fingers that clutched the opposing wand. It all looked so real, the mud, dirt, and leaves still clinging to Harry Potter's robes, his glasses slightly askew. Shattered suits of armor, cracks and blast marks in the floors and walls. People crowded in the background, all anxiously awaiting the outcome. With a start, Holly recognized Professor Hagrid, standing in the crowd, towering over the other people. Looking closer, Holly also recognized both Headmistress McGonagall and Professor Slughorn, with their wands extended, looking ready to jump into the fray if necessary. "It's a rather nice painting, don't you think?" Professor Lovegood's serene voice sounded nearby. Holly turned and saw Professor Lovegood standing behind her, also looking at the painting. "See? Here I am." She pointed out a tall, skinny blonde girl standing to one side, wearing purple leggings, her own wand extended, ready for use. It did look a lot like a younger Professor Lovegood. She pointed to a tall, bald black wizard standing next to Professor Slughorn, with his wand also extended, ready for action. "That's Kingsley Shacklebolt," the professor told Holly. "He's the Minister of Magic now." Minister Shacklebolt's gold earrings seemed to gleam in the morning sun. "And there," she pointed to a tall young man holding a sword in one hand, "is Professor Longbottom. He was very brave that day." Holly studied the painting further. Sasha wound herself around Holly's legs. Presently Holly asked, "Why doesn't it move?" "That's to remind us that more than wizards were affected by Lord Voldemort's rule," replied Professor Lovegood quietly. "It was painted by Michael Creevey, a Muggle. His son, Colin, first attended Hogwarts the same year I did. Colin always had a camera. I think he wanted to be a journalist. Colin and his family had to go into hiding 5 years later, when Lord Voldemort took over. At that time, the Ministry of Magic was arresting and imprisoning any person displaying wizard powers, but couldn't prove wizard parents. When Colin heard there would be a battle at Hogwarts against Lord Voldemort, he returned to join the fight. He died at Hogwarts." The two studied the painting further. "Mr. Creevey only painted as a hobby," Professor Lovegood continued in her reflections. "But when Colin died, he felt he had to do something. He wasn't here at the time, of course, but he conducted many interviews with people who were present, trying to find out what happened to Colin. He even talked to Harry. Then Mr. Creevey came here to paint. The rest of the wizards weren't keen on the idea, of course, but he was the only person Harry would approve to do a painting. I do believe it was the first time a Muggle ever visited Hogwarts." The school bell tolled loudly in the distance, bringing both back to the present. "That signals the time for dinner," commented Professor Lovegood. "Are you hungry? You should be after all that spell work." Holly thought about it and then nodded. "Yes, I am." Then perhaps you should go eat. Have a good day, Miss Wycliffe." Holly scooped up Sasha and put her on her shoulder. "Goodbye," she shouted as she raced down the corridor, leaving Professor Lovegood still gazing at the painting. At midnight, Holly found herself with the other Hufflepuff students stretched out on the lawn near the Forbidden Forest, watching the stars with Professor Ferenz. It had been a good thing they arrived early. Professor Ferenz, a handsome older centaur with silver hair and a palomino body, gazed deeply into Holly's face and said, "You have eyes like your cousin." "Cousin? What cousin?" whispered Becky. "I thought you had Muggle parents." "I do," whispered Holly back. "If Professor Ferenz knows your cousin, that means he must be wizard," said Mark. "So, who's your cousin?" Holly thought briefly about stalling, but she'd been meaning to tell them anyway, so decided to go for broke. She took a deep breath and said, "Harry Potter." "What?" exploded Becky and Mark together. "The night skies," interrupted Professor Ferenz in his deep, commanding but disinterested voice, "are best observed in silence." Both Becky and Mark were about to burst with questions, but the professor would permit no more talking. Other students soon arrived and settled down for class. The students snuggled under thick, warm blankets and leaned against puffy pillows while they gazed at the sky. Sasha slipped out and chased moths while the professor lectured. He pointed out basic constellations and star systems. He handed the students bewitched paper that gave off a gentle glow. On it, the students drew their own star charts directly from the stars. Mark complained that he couldn't see properly to take notes, but Holly thought it was the best class ever. Mark and Becky pinned Holly down for all the details about her relationship to Harry Potter after class, while they were walking back to their dorm. Holly told them how sick she had been all summer, and then waking up to see the mysterious Harry Potter sitting next to her bed, claiming to be her cousin. "I never even knew I had a cousin, let alone one that was a wizard," finished Holly. "But why didn't you tell us sooner?" exclaimed Mark. "He was just my cousin," replied Holly. "I'd never heard of him before. I had no idea he was famous." "And when you realized he was famous?" queried Becky. "Then it was too late. It would have sounded like boasting and bragging. I was going to tell you, I just didn't know how." "Well," said Becky, "I'm glad you did." "Yeah," said Mark. "Wait till I tell the others." "You can't do that," said Holly, panicked. "Then word will get out, and everyone will point and whisper behind my back like they do the Potters." Mark stopped, appalled. "We wouldn't do that. We're Hufflepuffs." But Holly was too scared. After much persuasion, Mark and Becky reluctantly agreed to keep the information about Harry Potter secret, for now. True to Mark's prediction, Holly could barely keep her eyes open during the potions class the next day. Fortunately, Becky kept on pinching Holly to keep her from yawning and slipping off into sleep. Of course, the potion Holly mixed turned a muddy brown instead of a sparkling green. She stirred it 7 times instead of 6 3/4. But Mark and Becky's green potions more than offset Holly's poor work. Professor Slughorn seemed disappointed that Holly's potion hadn't turned out right, especially after her success the first day. High marks on the quiz and a correctly mixed potion. But then he decided Holly had spent her time helping her classmates improve their scores. "Hufflepuffs always help each other," he said to himself as he examined and graded the finished potions. After all her practice on Expelliarmus, pushing a cube across the desk seemed easy. With a little whispered coaching, Mark and Becky were able to move their cubes also. Other students in the class were moving their cubes as well. The blonde Slytherin, Malfoy, got his cube to move so fast it went flying across the desk and shot into the air, hitting Sasha in the shoulder. Sasha gave a yowl of pain, jumped off Holly's shoulder, and hid under the desk. All this happened while Holly was in the middle of casting her own spell. Because of the sudden pain in Holly's shoulder, her spell went wild. Her cube shot across her desk, up into the air, and smashed into a huge flask of red liquid, splashing red fizzing stuff all over desks, students, and floor. "Oh, no!" exclaimed Holly, horrified at the damage she had caused. Professor Iverson sighed. She pointed her wand at the mess and shouted, "Reparo totalis." The flask returned to its original shape with its contents inside. Next time, Mr. Malfoy, you need to be less exuberant in your spell casting." "Sorry," said Malfoy with a straight face, but Holly could see and feel the smirk behind his and Richard's eyes. "They weren't sorry at all, were they?" hissed Becky angrily when they got out of class. She had already figured out that Holly's abilities made her exceptionally good at determining when someone was lying. "No, they weren't," agreed Holly, rubbing her still painful shoulder. "They may have even done it on purpose." "Sasha must be in a lot of pain for me to hurt like this," thought Holly. "Will she be okay?" asked Becky anxiously. "I hope so," said Holly. She cradled Sasha in her arms and gently massaged the cat's injured shoulder. In a few minutes, Holly's own pain receded. After a while, Sasha started to purr, so Holly knew the kitten was feeling better. "We're going to have to keep an eye on those two to make sure they don't try something else," said Mark grimly as they walked down to lunch. Classes after lunch seemed a breeze, but Holly was so tired she was glad when the school day ended. Defense against the dark arts the next day went well also. Even though Sasha stayed under the desks, Holly had already had a taste of success, so she was able to hold her own during practice. Holly's next major concern was broomstick practice on Thursday. Everyone else, even Becky, was looking forward with great excitement at the prospect of learning how to fly. Holly wasn't so sure, but it did look fun. At least they shared the lesson with the Gryffindors, so Holly didn't have to worry about the negative Slytherin emotions or someone accidentally bumping into Sasha while they learned to fly. Madam Hooch, a tall, energetic lady with short hair, brooked no nonsense. She lined them up into 2 rows and clearly went over all the rules before they even touched their brooms. Nervous anticipation and overall excitement made a solid wall of emotions behind Sasha's constant purr. Holly let the other students' emotions fill her, drowning out her own personal misgivings. After several attempts, most of the students had managed to bring the broomsticks to their hands with a single command: "Up!" Madam Hooch then told the students to mount your brooms. The students got on their brooms. "Now, when I blow my whistle," she directed, "kick off from the ground, hard. Keep your broom steady, rise a few feet, then come straight back down by leaning forward slightly." The whistle blew, and everyone tried to get their brooms into the air. It worked, mostly. Becky's broom hovered a few seconds and then did a nose drive, sticked end down, crashing into the grass. Holly's broom hovered and then just kind of gave out, flopping flatly on the ground. But others, like Albus, Mark, and Rose, made a graceful touchdown, landing after their few moments of hovering. Their second attempt went much better. Madam Hooch gave directions on steering, and, as the newer students got the hang of flying, the air gradually filled with students on brooms flying about. Soon the sky was filled with flying brooms, and no one wanted to land. Holly had never felt so free than she did with the wind whipping past her face while on a broom. True, her broom wobbled about when she tried for turns, but going straight it could easily zoom. Most exhilarating. She could tell the other students felt the same way. The sky became a free-for-all with flying brooms and students. "Look at me!" shouted Albus in delight. Holly looked up, laughing. Albus was high in the sky on his broom. He dove straight down between the other students coming out from beneath them. Then he wove in and out between the other, slower, wobbly students without touching a single one. Suddenly Holly found herself curled up on the ground in pain. Her world was a blur of agonizing pain. Her head hurt, her arms, her legs, her stomach, her whole body. In a haze, she heard herself screaming, but it didn't stop the pain. After what seemed an eternity, the pain receded. Holly felt Sasha perched on top of her, purring loudly. Her vision cleared, and she saw the faces of Mark and Becky hovering over her. "Are you okay?" asked Becky anxiously. I don't know," replied Holly. "What happened?" "There was a huge crash," Mark said as he helped her sit up. "A whole lot of students sort of ran into each other and fell to the ground in a pile-up," he explained, his face white. "You weren't anywhere near the crash, but you just fell to the ground screaming. It was scary. I mean, I knew you were an empath and all, but I didn't realize. Just what were you sick with all summer?" Before Holly could answer, Madam Hooch loomed overhead. "I got the rest of the injured students off to the infirmary," she said. How are you doing, Miss Wycliffe? Holly closed her eyes and focused. She heard and felt Sasha's purr. Almost immediately, most of the aches and pains disappeared. The pounding in her head remained. I think I hurt my head, she said finally. I am not surprised, said Madam Hooch. You took a nasty fall there. She looked at Holly's head briefly. Does it hurt over here? She asked, touching Holly's forehead lightly. Yes, agreed Holly, wincing. It could just be a nasty bump, but we'd best get it checked out. Miss Smith and Mr. Owens, would you escort Miss Wycliffe over to the infirmary, please? Becky and Mark nodded and helped Holly to stand. They slowly moved off the field. I can't go to the infirmary now, whispered Holly in a panic. The injured students, I can't go near them. It'll be okay, assured Mark. I once broke my arm after falling off my brother's broom. It hurt like heck for a while, but everything was fine after an hour or two. You'll see. You've got Sasha now. We'll go as close as you can, and then Becky or I will go the rest of the way to let Madame Pomfrey know you're there.